The Peterson family thought they had found their dream home. After years of apartment living, they finally had a place with a real backyard where their 2 kids could play safely. The house sat on a quiet street in Maple Ridge, a neighborhood that looked perfect in every real estate photo. Clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and friendly neighbors waving from their porches. For 15 wonderful years, life was exactly what they had hoped for. Tom worked at the local auto repair shop, while Lisa managed the front desk at a medical clinic. Their daughter Katie was now 12, and spent most afternoons practicing soccer kicks against the garage door. 8-year-old Danny preferred building elaborate dirt cities in the sandbox his dad had built under the big oak tree. The backyard was their sanctuary. Lisa had planted flower beds along the fence, filled with bright yellow daisies and purple petunias that attracted butterflies every summer. Tom had installed a small deck where they grilled burgers on weekends and watched the kids chase fireflies as the sun went down. It was the kind of simple, happy life that made all those years of saving for a down payment worth it. But everything changed when Prestige Property Management took over the Homeowners Association. The previous HOA had been run by Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher who lived 3 streets over. She would send friendly reminder letters about things like holiday decoration deadlines and reminded everyone to bring their trash cans in by Tuesday evening. Her biggest enforcement action had been asking the Rodriguez family to trim their hedge because it was blocking the sidewalk, which they did the next weekend with no hard feelings. Prestige Property Management operated differently. They hired patrol officers who drove around the neighborhood in white trucks with official-looking magnetic signs. These weren't friendly neighbors anymore. These were people with clipboards, cameras, and very specific ideas about how every single thing should look. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Lisa found an official notice taped to their front door. The letter, printed on expensive letterhead, informed them that their garden hose was improperly stored and needed to be coiled in regulation fashion within 72 hours or face a $50 fine. Lisa stared at the letter, then at the hose, which was neatly wound around the hose reel Tom had mounted on the side of the house exactly like every other house on the block. She called the number on the letter and spent 20 minutes on hold listening to elevator music before reaching someone who explained that hoses must be coiled clockwise when viewed from above. Tom laughed when she told him about it that evening. Clockwise hoses? What's next, alphabetized grass blades? But he went outside and recoiled the hose anyway. It wasn't worth the fight or the money. That weekend, another notice appeared. This time, Katie's soccer goal was positioned 2½ inches beyond the approved setback from the property line. The goal had been in the same spot for 3 years. Lisa measured the distance herself and found that if anything, it was further from the fence than the regulations required. The notices kept coming. Danny's sandbox was declared a non-conforming play structure because it didn't have an official safety inspection certificate. The bird feeder that had hung from the oak tree for a decade was suddenly a non-approved exterior decoration. Even their outdoor furniture received a citation for being the wrong color, despite being the same beige plastic chairs they had purchased specifically because they looked identical to everyone else's. But the strangest part was how these violations were being discovered. The family was always careful to follow the rules, even the ridiculous new ones. Yet somehow the patrol officers seemed to know about things that couldn't be seen from the street or the sidewalk. Danny's toy truck scattered behind the garage, Lisa's gardening gloves left on the back porch steps, Katie's bicycle leaning against the fence in the far corner of the yard. It was Katie who figured it out first. She came running into the house one afternoon, excited and upset at the same time. "Mom, there's a strange man in our backyard." Lisa dropped her coffee mug and rushed outside but found the yard empty. Katie insisted she had seen someone walking around near the flower beds taking pictures with a phone. When Lisa called the HOA number, they assured her that all inspections were conducted from public areas only. But the next day, they received a violation notice about weeds in the flower bed that could only be seen from inside their yard. Tom decided to install a security camera system. Nothing fancy, just a couple of cameras from the hardware store that would record to his old laptop in the garage. He mounted one near the back door and another with a view of the side gate where the flower beds were located. The footage from the first week was normal. Delivery trucks, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes. But on Thursday afternoon, something interesting appeared. A man in a white polo shirt and khaki pants walked up to their fence, looked around to make sure no one was watching, then climbed over like he owned the place. The family watched in amazement as the patrol officer walked around their backyard, taking photos of anything that might possibly be considered a violation. He measured the distance between outdoor furniture and the fence with a small tape measure. He examined the children's toys with the intensity of a detective investigating a crime scene. He even peered through the back windows of the house, holding his hand up to block the glare. This went on for 20 minutes. When he was finished documenting everything, he climbed back over the fence and drove away in his white truck. Tom was furious. Lisa was scared. The kids were confused about why a stranger was allowed to walk around their backyard without permission. But what bothered the family most was how normal this seemed to be for the patrol officer. He moved around their property, like he had done it hundreds of times before. They filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, including screenshots from their security footage. The response was disappointing, but not surprising. The board claimed that homeowners' agreements gave them the right to inspect properties for compliance, and that patrol officers were simply doing their jobs. When Tom pointed out that the officer had trespassed on private property without permission, the board's lawyer sent a letter explaining that the HOA had reasonable access rights for inspections. When Lisa asked why they couldn't knock on the front door like normal people, she was told that inspections needed to be conducted when homeowners weren't present to ensure objective assessment. The Peterson family tried everything they could think of. They installed a lock on their side gate and posted no trespassing signs. They sent certified letters demanding that all inspections be scheduled in advance. They even offered to give the HOA a key to their gate if they would agree to reasonable inspection hours and advance notice. Nothing worked. The patrol officer continued climbing their fence. The violation notices continued arriving. And the family continued feeling like prisoners in their own home. That's when Grandpa Joe came to visit. Joe Peterson was Tom's father, a 78-year-old retired electrician with strong opinions about right and wrong. He had planned to stay for just 2 weeks to help fix some plumbing issues and spend time with his grandchildren. But when Tom showed him the security footage of strangers climbing around his backyard, those 2 weeks turned into something much longer. Grandpa Joe had spent 40 years wiring houses, fixing electrical problems, and dealing with building inspectors who sometimes got a little too big for their britches. He had also served in the military, where he learned that some problems required creative solutions. After watching the security footage 3 times, Grandpa Joe made himself a cup of coffee, sat down in his favorite kitchen chair, and started making plans. Grandpa Joe's first morning at the Peterson house started with him sitting on the back porch, drinking coffee and watching the birds. He had always been an early riser, and at 78, he wasn't about to change that habit. The sun was just coming up over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns that all looked exactly the same. He was enjoying the peaceful moment when he heard footsteps on the other side of the fence. Heavy boots walking slowly, deliberately like someone trying not to be heard. Joe set down his coffee cup and listened carefully. The footsteps stopped right at their gate. Then he heard the familiar sound of someone climbing over metal fencing. Joe stood up quietly and walked to the corner of the porch where he could see the side yard. Sure enough, there was the patrol officer, in his white polo shirt, dropping down into their backyard like he owned the place. The man pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of Lisa's flower beds, zooming in on anything that might be considered out of place. This was Joe's first time seeing the trespassing in person, and it made his blood boil. In all his years, he had never seen such disrespect for private property. When he was growing up, you didn't set foot on someone else's land without permission. It was a matter of basic respect and common decency. The patrol officer spent nearly 30 minutes walking around their yard. He photographed the kids' toys, measured the distance between their patio furniture and the fence, and even took pictures through the kitchen window. Joe watched it all, memorizing every detail and getting angrier by the minute. When Tom and Lisa left for work that morning, Joe told them what he had witnessed. Tom wasn't surprised, but Lisa looked tired and frustrated. She had been losing sleep over the constant stress of wondering what new violation notice would be waiting for them each day. "I don't understand why they won't just knock on the front door like normal people," Lisa said, gathering her purse and keys. "We've never refused an inspection. We just want them to ask first." "Because they don't want to be normal people," Joe replied. "They want to catch you doing something wrong, not work with you to follow the rules." That afternoon, Joe decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to see what he was dealing with. He had been a problem solver his entire life, first in the military and then as an electrician. Every problem had a solution if you understood it well enough. What he found during his walk was interesting. The Peterson family wasn't the only one, having trouble with the new HOA management. Mrs. Rodriguez at the corner house had received 3 violation notices in the past month. The young couple 2 doors down had been fined for having the wrong color mailbox, even though it was the same mailbox that came with the house when they bought it. But the most revealing conversation was with Betty Walsh, an elderly woman who lived directly across the street. She had been watching the neighborhood activities from her front window for the past 20 years and had seen everything. "That patrolman comes by almost every day," she told Joe as they stood in her driveway. "He walks around the block first, looking to see if anyone's home. If the driveways are empty, he starts climbing fences. I've seen him go into at least 6 different backyards." Betty had been keeping a notebook of what she observed, including dates and times. She showed Joe entries going back 3 months, documenting a pattern of systematic trespassing that happened almost exclusively when families were at work or school. "Have you reported this to anyone?" Joe asked. "Who would I report it to?" "The HOA hired him. The police say it's a civil matter. Between homeowners and the association, I'm just one old lady with a notebook." Joe thanked Betty for the information and continued his walk, but his mind was already working on the problem. This wasn't just about the Peterson family anymore. This was about a company that was systematically bullying an entire neighborhood, hiding behind legal contracts and hoping people wouldn't fight back. When Tom came home from work that evening, he found his father sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in notes and diagrams. Joe had spent the afternoon researching HOA laws, property rights, and inspection procedures on Tom's computer. "Dad, what are you working on?" Tom asked, loosening his work shirt and grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. "I'm studying the enemy," Joe replied without looking up. "Did you know that even though the HOA has inspection rights, they're still required to use reasonable access methods? Climbing fences isn't reasonable when there's a perfectly good front door." Joe had also discovered that the HOA was required to provide advance notice of inspections except in cases of emergency or immediate safety concerns. Taking pictures of children's toys and measuring outdoor furniture hardly qualified as emergencies. "I talked to a lawyer today," Joe continued, showing Tom a page of notes. "Fellow named Roberts who specializes in HOA disputes. He says we have a strong case for harassment and trespassing, especially with the security footage." Tom sat down at the table, interested but cautious. Legal battles were expensive, and he wasn't sure they could afford a long fight with the HOA's lawyers. "The lawyer says we don't necessarily need to sue them," Joe explained. "Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to make people behave reasonably. But we need to document everything and show a pattern of bad behavior." Over the next few days, Joe put together a comprehensive file of evidence. He organized all the violation notices by date, printed screenshots from the security footage, and wrote detailed descriptions of each trespassing incident. He also reached out to other neighbors who were having similar problems and collected their stories. The pattern was clear and disturbing. The patrol officer was systematically targeting families when they weren't home, looking for any excuse to issue violations and collect fines. The violations were often for ridiculous things that had never been problems before, suggesting that the new management company was more interested in generating revenue than maintaining neighborhood standards. Joe's military training had taught him to gather intelligence before taking action, and his years as an electrician had taught him that every system had weaknesses. The HOA's system relied on intimidation and the assumption that homeowners wouldn't fight back. But they had made a mistake when they decided to mess with his family. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Joe was babysitting his grandchildren. Katie and Danny were playing in the backyard while he watched from the porch, enjoying the sight of kids being kids in their own safe space. Around 2 o'clock, Joe heard the familiar sound of someone climbing their fence. But this time, instead of an empty yard, the patrol officer dropped down to find Grandpa Joe sitting on the porch and 2 children playing nearby. The man froze for a moment, clearly not expecting anyone to be home. Joe stood up slowly, his expression calm but his eyes hard. "Can I help you with something?" Joe asked politely. The patrol officer cleared his throat and pulled out his clipboard. "Just conducting a routine inspection, sir. HOA business." "I see," Joe replied. "And you always climb over people's fences instead of knocking on the front door?" "The homeowners aren't required to be present for inspections," the man said, avoiding eye contact. "We have authorization from the association." Joe nodded thoughtfully. "Well, now that you're here, why don't you come inside and we can discuss this properly? I have some questions about your inspection procedures." The patrol officer shook his head quickly. "That won't be necessary. I'll just finish up here and be on my way." He spent another 10 minutes taking photos and making notes, but Joe could tell the man was uncomfortable being watched. When he was finished, instead of climbing back over the fence, he walked to the gate and asked Joe to unlock it so he could leave through the front yard. That evening, Joe called the lawyer again. It was time to take action. That Friday evening, after the kids were in bed and Tom and Lisa were relaxing in the living room, Grandpa Joe made an announcement that would change everything. "I'm going to fix this problem," he said, setting down his coffee cup with the kind of determination that made people pay attention. "But I'm going to need a few days to work in the garage without anyone asking questions." Tom looked up from his newspaper. "Dad, what are you planning?" Joe smiled the way he used to when Tom was little and asked too many questions about his electrical projects. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that teach people to behave properly without anyone getting hurt. He had spent the entire day researching electric fence systems on Tom's computer, reading through safety regulations and installation guides. What he discovered was fascinating. Electric fencing was completely legal for residential use as long as it met certain safety requirements and was properly marked with warning signs. The systems used on farms to contain livestock worked on a simple principle. They delivered a sharp, uncomfortable shock that was startling but not dangerous. The voltage was low enough to be safe for humans and animals, but high enough to be memorable. More importantly, they were designed to teach respect for boundaries. Saturday morning, Joe drove to the farm supply store on the outskirts of town. The teenage clerk looked surprised when a well-dressed elderly man walked in asking about electric fence chargers. But Joe explained that he was helping his son keep deer out of their vegetable garden. He purchased a basic livestock fence charger, 50 feet of insulated wire, several ground rods, and a collection of warning signs that read, "Electric fence, do not touch." The total cost was less than one of the HOA's violation fines. Back home, Joe spread everything out in the garage and began planning his installation. The beauty of the system was its simplicity. The charger would send pulses of electricity through the wire at regular intervals. Anyone who touched the electrified surface would complete the circuit and receive a harmless but unforgettable reminder about respecting other people's property. The tricky part was making the installation look completely normal while being effective. Joe decided to run the wire through the existing fence posts, connecting it to the metal components of the gate itself. From the outside, nothing would look different. But anyone who grabbed the gate to climb over it would get an immediate education about trespassing. Sunday morning, while Tom and Lisa took the kids to visit Lisa's mother, Joe got to work. 40 years of electrical experience made the installation straightforward. He mounted the charger in the garage, ran the ground wire to a copper rod driven deep into the earth, and carefully threaded the hot wire through the fence structure. The most important part was the safety measures. Joe installed multiple warning signs at eye level on both sides of the gate. He wired a master switch inside the house so the system could be turned off instantly if needed. He set the voltage at the lowest effective level, just enough to get someone's attention without causing harm. By noon, the system was complete and tested. Joe used a voltage meter to verify that everything was working properly, then tested it himself with a blade of grass to make sure the shock was sharp but safe. It felt like touching a car door after walking across carpet in winter, startling and uncomfortable but not painful. The hardest part was waiting. Joe knew from Betty Walsh's observations that the patrol officer usually came by on Tuesday or Wednesday afternoons. That gave him 2 days to make sure everything was working perfectly and to position himself for the best view of what he expected would be a very educational moment. Monday evening, Joe explained the basics of the system to Tom and Lisa without going into too much detail. He showed them the warning signs, demonstrated how to turn the system on and off, and assured them that everything was completely safe and legal. "Dad, are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, looking worried. "What if something goes wrong?" "Honey, I've been working with electricity longer than you've been alive," Joe replied gently. "This system is designed to be safe. It's the same thing farmers use to keep million-dollar bulls from wandering off their property. The only thing that's going to get hurt is someone's pride." Tom was more concerned about the legal implications. What if the HOA tries to press charges? Joe pulled out a folder thick with printed pages. "I've done my homework. Electric fencing is legal for residential use in this county as long as it's properly installed and marked. I have permits, safety, certificates, and documentation showing that the system meets all local codes. Plus, anyone who gets shocked will have to admit they were trespassing on private property after ignoring posted warnings." Tuesday morning, Joe set up his observation post on the back porch. He arranged his favorite lawn chair for the best view of the gate, brought out a thermos of coffee, his transistor radio, and the morning newspaper. To anyone watching, he looked like a harmless old man enjoying a peaceful retirement morning. But Joe was far from relaxed. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the gate, listening for the sound of footsteps or a vehicle in the street. He had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, and he wanted to be sure he didn't miss it. Around 10 o'clock, he heard Betty Walsh calling from across the street. She was watering her flowers but had positioned herself where she could see the Petersons' backyard. "Morning, Joe," she called out. "Beautiful day for sitting outside." Joe waved back, understanding that Betty was letting him know she was keeping watch too. The elderly woman had become an unofficial ally in their campaign against the trespassing patrol officer. The morning passed quietly. Joe read his newspaper, listened to the radio, and tried to look as innocent and harmless as possible. But inside, he felt the same focused intensity he had experienced during his military service when preparing for an important mission. Just after lunch, he heard the familiar sound of the white patrol truck turning onto their street. Joe folded his newspaper and settled back in his chair, making sure he had a clear view of the gate while appearing to be completely absorbed in his coffee and radio program. The truck parked in front of the Rodriguez house, which was the patrol officer's usual starting point. Joe could hear footsteps on the sidewalk getting closer to their property. His heart started beating faster, but he forced himself to remain calm and motionless. The footsteps stopped at their gate. Joe heard the familiar sound of someone testing the latch, trying to see if it was locked. There was a moment of silence, then the unmistakable sound of someone preparing to climb over the fence. Joe took a sip of coffee and waited for the education to begin. The moment Joe had been waiting for finally arrived on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2:15. He had been sitting on the porch for over an hour, pretending to read his newspaper while keeping one eye on the gate. The patrol officer had finished checking the Rodriguez house and was now walking slowly toward the Peterson property. Joe could hear the man's footsteps on the sidewalk, heavy and deliberate. The officer always followed the same routine: walk around the front of the house first, check to see if any cars were in the driveway, then make his way to the side gate where he would begin his unauthorized inspection. From his chair on the porch, Joe watched as the patrol officer approached their gate. The man was wearing his usual white polo shirt and khaki pants, carrying his clipboard and camera phone. He looked confident and casual, like someone who had done this hundreds of times before without any consequences. The officer stopped at the gate and tested the handle, confirming that it was locked as always. Joe held his breath and tried to look completely absorbed in his newspaper, though his heart was pounding with anticipation. What happened next was better than Joe could have imagined. The patrol officer looked around to make sure no one was watching, then grabbed the metal gate with both hands and began pulling himself up to climb over. The moment his palms made contact with the electrified metal, the fence charger delivered its lesson. The shock sent the man flying backward like he had been launched from a catapult. He landed hard in Lisa's rose bushes, arms and legs flailing, as he tried to get his balance. The thorns caught his shirt and scratched his arms, adding insult to injury as he struggled to get back on his feet. Joe had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. The sight of the arrogant trespasser getting his comeuppance was more satisfying than he had expected, but he knew this was just the beginning of what needed to be a very carefully handled conversation. The patrol officer finally extracted himself from the rose bushes, looking around wildly to figure out what had happened. His hair was messed up, his shirt was torn, and he had several small scratches on his arms from the thorns. But most importantly, he looked completely shocked and confused. "You all right over there, son?" Joe called out from his porch, using his most innocent and concerned voice. "Sounded like you took quite a tumble." The officer spun around, apparently just noticing that someone had been watching the whole incident. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, and Joe could see him trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. "That gate," the officer stammered, pointing accusingly at the innocent-looking fence. "There's something wrong with it. It gave me an electric shock." Joe set down his newspaper and stood up slowly, like a concerned neighbor who wanted to help. "Oh my, that sounds serious. Are you hurt? Should I call someone?" "What did you do to that gate?" the officer demanded, his voice getting louder. "You can't booby-trap your property, that's illegal." Joe walked over to the fence, being careful not to touch the electrified parts himself. He pointed to the multiple warning signs that were posted at eye level all around the gate. "Well, I'm not sure what you mean by booby-trap. This here is just a standard electric fence system, same as what farmers use. See all these signs? They say electric fence, do not touch in pretty big letters." The patrol officer looked at the signs for the first time, his anger mixing with embarrassment as he realized he had ignored multiple clear warnings. "You can't just electrify your fence without permission." "Actually, I can," Joe replied calmly, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Got all the permits right here. Electric fencing is perfectly legal for residential use in this county, as long as it's properly installed and marked, which it is." Betty Walsh had heard the commotion and came out of her house ostensibly to water her front flower beds, but really to get a better view of what was happening. Joe noticed her positioning herself where she could hear and see everything. "Besides," Joe continued, "I'm curious about why you were trying to climb over our gate in the first place. Most folks just knock on the front door when they want to visit." The officer's face got even redder. "I was conducting an HOA inspection. We have the right to inspect properties for compliance violations." "Is that so?" Joe said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I've been sitting here for the better part of 2 hours and I didn't see anyone knock on our front door. In fact, it looked to me like you were trying to sneak into our backyard without permission." By now, Mrs. Rodriguez had come out to see what all the noise was about, and Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down was standing in his driveway pretending to check his mailbox. The patrol officer was starting to realize that his usual secretive approach wasn't working so well with an audience. "The HOA has inspection rights," the officer insisted, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I don't need permission to check for violations." Joe nodded agreeably. "You know, you might be right about that. But I'm pretty sure those inspection rights don't include trespassing on private property, and they definitely don't include ignoring posted warnings about electric fences." He walked closer to the gate, still being careful not to touch the electrified parts. "Tell you what, though, if you'd like to conduct a proper inspection, I'd be happy to unlock this gate for you. All you have to do is ask nicely, like civilized people do." The patrol officer looked around at the growing audience of neighbors, all of whom were clearly enjoying his discomfort. His shirt was still torn, his hair was disheveled, and the scratches from the rose bushes were starting to show, red marks on his arms. "This isn't over," he muttered, gathering what was left of his dignity. "The association is going to hear about this." "I certainly hope so," Joe replied cheerfully. "In fact, I've got some things I'd like to discuss with them myself. Like why their patrol officers think it's acceptable to climb over people's fences instead of using the front door." The officer started walking back toward his truck, but Joe wasn't finished with the conversation. "Oh, and son," Joe called after him, "next time you decide to ignore warning signs and trespass on someone's property, you might want to make sure there isn't a retired electrician sitting on the porch watching you do it." As the patrol truck drove away, Betty Walsh came across the street with a big smile on her face. "Joe, that was the most entertaining thing I've seen in 20 years of living in this neighborhood." Joe chuckled and sat back down in his lawn chair. "Well, sometimes people need a little reminder about basic manners and respect for other folks' property." Mrs. Rodriguez walked over too, still grinning. "I can't believe he actually climbed right into those electric wires after reading all those warning signs." "Some people have to learn things the hard way," Joe replied, picking up his newspaper. "But I have a feeling he won't be climbing any more fences around here." That evening, when Tom and Lisa came home from work, they found Joe sitting peacefully on the porch as if nothing had happened. But the big smile on his face and the way he kept chuckling to himself told them that something important had occurred. "How was your day, Dad?" Tom asked. "Oh, pretty educational," Joe replied with a twinkle in his eye. "Had a nice chat with that patrol fellow. I think we understand each other much better now." The phone started ringing at 7 o'clock the next morning. Tom was getting ready for work when he heard Lisa answer with a cautious, "Hello?" followed by a long pause, and then a big smile spreading across her face. "That was Betty Walsh," Lisa announced after hanging up. "She says 3 different neighbors have called her already this morning asking about electric fence systems. Word is spreading fast about what happened yesterday." Joe was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper, like it was any other normal day. But Tom could tell his father was pleased with himself. There was a satisfied gleam in his eyes that Tom remembered from childhood, the same look Joe used to get when he solved a particularly tricky electrical problem. The second phone call came from the HOA office at 9:30. Tom had already left for work, so Lisa took the call. The voice on the other end was official and stern, demanding to speak with the homeowner responsible for the dangerous modifications to the fence. "I'll have my father-in-law call you back," Lisa replied calmly. "He's the one who installed the electric fence system, legally, I might add, with all the proper permits and warning signs." When Joe returned the call an hour later, he was ready. For them. He had spent 40 years dealing with building inspectors, city officials, and other bureaucrats who sometimes tried to push people around. This was no different. The HOA representative started the conversation with threats and demands. The electric fence was dangerous, they claimed. It was installed without proper authorization. The patrol officer could have been seriously injured. They were considering filing charges and demanding immediate removal of the system. Joe listened patiently to the entire rant before responding in his calm, measured voice. "Well, now that's interesting," he said, "because I have a different perspective on what happened. I have video footage of your patrol officer trespassing on private property, after ignoring multiple warning signs. I also have documentation showing that my electric fence system is completely legal and properly installed." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Furthermore," Joe continued, "I've been talking to other neighbors who have similar stories about your patrol officer climbing fences and entering backyards without permission. I'm thinking the police might be very interested in hearing about systematic trespassing in our neighborhood." The tone of the conversation changed quickly after that. The HOA representative started talking about misunderstandings and improved communication instead of threats and demands. Joe wasn't finished. "I've also been in touch with a lawyer who specializes in property rights cases. He tells me that harassment lawsuits against HOA management companies are becoming quite common these days, especially when there's clear evidence of trespassing and intimidation." By the end of the phone call, the HOA was suggesting a meeting to discuss better inspection procedures rather than demanding removal of the fence. The meeting took place the following Thursday evening in the community center conference room. Tom and Lisa attended along with Joe, plus 4 other neighbors who had been having similar problems with the patrol officer. Betty Walsh came too, bringing her notebook full of observations about the trespassing incidents. The HOA board members, looked uncomfortable from the moment they walked into the room. They had clearly expected to intimidate a single family into compliance, not face a group of organized neighbors with documentation and legal representation. Joe's lawyer, Mr. Roberts, presented a timeline of incidents backed up by security footage, written complaints, and witness statements. The pattern was clear and undeniable. The patrol officer had been systematically trespassing on private property while conducting what the HOA called routine inspections. "The law is very clear about this," Mr. Roberts explained to the room. "Homeowners associations have inspection rights, but they must exercise those rights reasonably and legally. Climbing fences and entering backyards without permission is trespassing, regardless of what your contract says." The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that they had broad inspection authority, but even he seemed to realize it was a losing battle when faced with video evidence of their patrol officer ignoring warning signs and getting shocked by a perfectly legal electric fence. The settlement negotiations didn't take long. Faced with the possibility of expensive lawsuits and bad publicity, the HOA agreed to several important changes. First, they would establish new inspection procedures requiring advance notice and reasonable access through front doors or with homeowner permission. No more fence climbing or unauthorized entry into backyards. Second, they would remove the current patrol officer from duty in the Maple Ridge neighborhood and assign someone else who understood proper procedures. Third, they would pay the Peterson family's legal fees and issue a formal apology for the harassment and trespassing incidents. Most importantly, they agreed to revise their enforcement policies to focus on genuine community concerns, rather than generating revenue through excessive fines for minor violations. The changes were immediate and dramatic. Within a week, other families in the neighborhood noticed that violation notices had stopped arriving for ridiculous things like improperly coiled hoses and non-regulation outdoor furniture placement. The new patrol officer, when he eventually started making rounds, knocked on front doors and scheduled inspections like a normal person. The few violations he did cite were for legitimate issues like overgrown hedges blocking sidewalks or actual safety concerns. Word of Joe's electric fence solution spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. At the next community barbecue, he found himself surrounded by neighbors wanting to hear the full story and asking technical questions about electric fence installation. "The key," Joe explained to a group gathered around the picnic table, "isn't the electricity. It's the principle. Some people only understand boundaries when those boundaries have consequences." Mrs. Rodriguez raised her beer in a toast to Grandpa Joe, who taught the HOA patrol some respect for private property. The whole neighborhood cheered, and Joe's face turned red with embarrassment and pride. 3 months later, the electric fence was still operational, but rarely needed. Word had gotten around to every HOA patrol officer in the county about the house with the electrified gate and the retired electrician who didn't tolerate trespassing. The Peterson family never received another unreasonable violation notice. Their children could play in the backyard without worrying about strangers taking photos through the fence. Lisa's flower beds remained undisturbed, and Tom could leave his tools outside without getting citations for improperly stored equipment. Joe's planned 2-week visit had turned into a permanent move. He had found a purpose in protecting his family and community from bureaucratic bullying, and the neighborhood had found a champion who knew how to fight back effectively. The electric fence became something of a local legend. Neighbors would bring visitors by to see the famous gate that shocked the HOA into behaving. Joe would always smile and point to the warning signs, reminding everyone that the system worked because it was fair, clearly marked, properly installed, and designed to teach respect rather than cause harm. Sometimes, he would tell people, the old-fashioned solutions are still the best ones. You just have to be smart about how you apply them to modern problems. The white patrol truck still drove through Maple Ridge, but they never stopped at the Peterson house. And whenever Joe sat on his porch in the afternoons, enjoying his coffee and watching his grandchildren play safely in their own backyard, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from standing up for what's right and winning.